Hi, guys. Welcome back to virtual only AP Psych. Today we're going to be talking about and doing a lesson on section 1 and 2. And so make sure you have your section 1 and 2 notes out. Make sure you've answered that section 1 reflection question, which is your submission activity for last class. So one of the first things that it does in your textbook is it has that one page that has the pencils on it, and it talks about a story with some college students and also a professor. And all of the stories that it's related to kids are going to be about college students because it is a college textbook. So I want you to think about what are the major challenges that those students are having in the story. So as you recall, there was a lot of things about study skills and test anxiety. A lot of kids didn't do well on the tests that the professor had given, and she was talking about how they didn't get independent and dependent variables. The success of every student was a little bit different. So even though they were in that same situation, each of them had different things. So one had a difficulty with flashcards, and there is a good way of doing flashcards, and it's not just putting vocabulary down. At the very end of your chapter, of chapter 1, it actually tells you the answer to that and goes over how to do flashcards the right way, which is putting it in context. So I never teach vocabulary without context and have just a list of vocabulary words that you learn without having context around it, and that's what you put on the flashcards. So you can check that out. Also, there's one student that's talking about how their girlfriend gave them a bracelet that was supposed to be about memory and concentration. As if you remember, the professor said, yeah, I don't think that there's any research on that to have any, a metal or ion bracelet affecting your brain and memory. That's just not how it works. So all of them had very different experiences in that series. When we look at the study of psychology, right, we look at the idea that it's about behavior and mental processes. And as you learn in section 1 and even in section 2, the process of coming up with both of these has been a long process of history of psychology. We can extend that from having it about one brain to a group of people that all collectively come with different things with them, and also culture. And a lot of this is based on extensive research. As you know, it all started with our founder of psychology and his first psychology lab, and it was very scientifically based. So what are the goals of psychology? There are 4. Try to find that in your notes. What are the 4 goals of psychology? Well, they are describe, predict, explain, influence, or control. And psychologists, when they're meeting somebody, like a therapist or such, they do this innately. They look at these 4 things innately. So we're going to go over them a couple different ways today to try to understand what these 4 goals are. When you look at somebody, you're meeting somebody, or you're working with a species, because psychology is not only about humans, but it also psychologists work with animals. So you want to objectively look at what their experience is. So you can see this woman's interacting with a chimpanzee. She's given it something that's a human object. So she's in a naturalistic type observation, but she's more interesting where, and if she was kind of sitting out into the trees, not interacting and not giving the chimpanzee anything, she would not be, she would be truly in its natural state. But she is going to observe. She's not going to draw any conclusions about it. She's just going to say, what do I absolutely know for certain in an objective way? Predict is what are the different environmental things or things that would create an issue or environmental exposure that is affecting the organism. And then explain, and that's why I put this picture, because it's all like what environmental things are going on that are affecting that person. And then explain is why is it that one specific person or organism in an environment acts differently or is more vulnerable to those issues or environment than another. So we'll get into what that is. And then psychologists will also then obviously do control and influence. Once we know all those things, how do we help that person and what they need? So if we go back to the prologue about the college students, how might we apply these 4 goals of psychology? Well, number 1, we're going to be looking at and describing sort of their emotional responses that led to some of their stress about the test. We're going to talk about what their study strategies were, or not, like wearing the bracelet, and what their responses were. And then we're going to look at what created their response and their behavior, what led to them studying that way, and then what led to having more or less stress in that situation. And then because all of them are in the same situation, they all took a test, they all studied a certain way, why is it that some people in that instance, react very differently in that situation than others? For instance, somebody taking a test, they both get the same grade. One is really stressed out about it, and the other one's like, oh, that's okay, or maybe I'll do better next time. So they're in the same situation, and then why is one reacting differently? And so all of them in that prologue, there are different reactions to their actual test. And then as you see, the professor is starting to give some coping strategies. Let's work on maybe going over this again, or a different way of doing flashcards, or the bracelet doesn't work. So they're all trying to control and influence. So what we're going to be doing with this is we're going to be applying it to a case study. And when you come out of this first part of the lecture, you're going to be applying those goals of psychology to Billy. You're going to read Billy's case study, and you are going to apply and look at objectively what is going on with Billy. He is a teenager just like you. And what are the things we absolutely know? You're going to write that. You can type it up in the paper. You can print it out. You can do whatever you like with it. It's for you to practice with. We're going to predict what different situations or issues, what is causing the issues with Billy. The objective things that you pulled out, what are the different environmental things? And then there are other kids in Billy's situation. What makes him more vulnerable to respond the way he is and different from other kids? And then I want you to come up with what are some ways that we can control and influence? What can be done to help Billy in his situation, and so forth. Okay, so you're going to be doing that. I would print out the handout that you have that's out into the Canvas page, and I would write out your answers and so forth. We're going to be discussing them during the Zoom conference that we'll have next week that I'll tell you when that is. And we're also going to be discussing another piece about Billy that I'm going to be talking about later on. So, seems a little simple once we do it, but I'm going to show you how complex actually psychology is. And we've seen that because the study of psychology has evolved over time. What you need to know is that the roots of great thinkers, even though some of their methods are not being used or seem to be more ineffective or invalid because of research, scientists have been impacted by them in some way, and so they have some importance. So, and when you look at the history of it, let's see what influences that philosophy had on psychology. For this, in your notes, you should have things about Socrates. Socrates believed the mind and the body were separate, and that knowledge just came innately to humans, that we just innately would acquire knowledge no matter what. Aristotle sort of disagreed with him. He believed that knowledge was not pre-existing, that it was based on our experiences and so forth. And what some cool things that he did was he used data and observation, and he studied a lot of things about perception, motivation, and memory, and he wrote the first treatises of psychology. So there's a lot of even common things that Aristotle did way, way back. That's pretty cool as a basis for this study. Descartes also believed that the mind and the body were separate, and he talked about interactive dualism, and he figured this out through a bunch of different methods. But if you think about it, the mind and the body, certainly are separate. Have you ever been in a situation where maybe you're mad at your little brother or sister, and you are fuming in your head, but yet you're gently either brushing their hair or tying their shoe in a gentle way, but in your mind you're thinking something completely different. So if you think about it, mind and body, you can be thinking something and doing something that's completely opposite in its nature. He did this by dissecting animals and looking at their brain cavities, and he really had some really cool discoveries in nerve pathways. Excuse me, nerve pathways And he thought that all that fluid like flowed around the body. And really what he was discovering were neuron and nerve pathways that create muscle movement. So they had some really cool discoveries that they didn't even know that's what they were discovering. Sir Francis Bacon was another one. Our minds love pattern, and we love to see things in order and see that pattern and things organized in a similar way. And that's how our brain sort of remembers things. And he worked on that. And then we have somebody like John Locke, who actually had an influence not only on government, life, liberty, and property, but also he had an influence on psychology. He believed in those natural born rights that everyone is born with, and with that is your own ability. So it's like that humanistic perspective that we have, that our own abilities we have at birth, and that our mind is a blank slate. And so like Aristotle, he believed that knowledge comes from experience. And he also believed that we should rely on observation and experience and experimentation. So a lot, again, like Aristotle, of like that scientific thing. Francis Gallion gave us nature versus nurture. Now in psychology today, we really don't separate one or the other. When I was growing up and going through this field, it's from the very beginning, 25 years ago, it was pick either one or the other. And today it's really heredity versus environment, and it's really about the interchange of those two. We don't have just heredity or environment. It's what is more important in a situation. Did genes play more of a role or did environment? But that whole thing came from Francis Gallen. And then what influence did physiology have on psychology? And this one you should have something connected to the body. So what you're going to find this year is there's a lot of biology and that connection of the brain to behavior. And everything's going to have a biological portion to it, and that's really important. Okay, who is our founder of psychology? Who's that picture of? If you said Wilhelm Wundt, you would be correct. He is German. He is the psychology started in a different country and then eventually will come to the United States. And he used the scientific method. And that exam tip that I put on the screen there is really going to help you as well. I'll put a few of those up here and there. The exam will reflect psychology as a science. And the tradition of Wilhelm Wundt, even though we don't use structuralism anymore, but the essence of the fact that he based it on scientific data is something that's really important, and that makes psychology not common sense. So what he did with that is he was looking for, and I would copy down in your notes that idea of that I put there as he is studying the atoms of the mind. And I mean, what the heck does that mean, right? So he's trying to find the pieces of your consciousness and how your mental processes occur. So what he did was he took a machine that looked like a telegraph, and he would drop a ball, and then somebody would, as soon as they heard the ball drop, they would press a lever down. And he wasn't necessarily like concentrating on the action of pressing the lever down. He was about the processing of what's the time lapse between you hearing and their sensation of hearing the ball drop, and then your response time there. And he was studying consciousness, okay? I'm going to put a video up on Canvas too. You'll see it in this blue link here. It goes through sort of the history, and it's very short, but it may help you to visualize a few things. Sorry, the bell's ringing. Okay, so let's do an exercise with introspection, okay? Take a second or so and and this should happen very, very quickly. Think about or write down, as I have them do in class, 3 observations about this particular object. And so by now you should have come up with those. It should immediately, what's the first thing that pops in your head when you hear those 3? Okay, now some people, and we compared them with partners when we were in class there, what do you notice about this? So some of you may talk about its color. Some of you may talk about the fact that it's a sneaker. Some of you may talk about feelings. It's overwhelming, it's weird, it's wild, whatever it might be. And so what you do is you kind of compare and contrast that with other people. And we look at it and it's the idea that we're looking inward, okay? So what Titchener did with introspection and this idea of structuralism is to see your mental processes in your consciousness. You're not trying to get and dig and bring things out of your consciousness. It's whatever's on the surface. So that idea of like, okay, if I said to you, give me the first word that pops in your head when you hear the word pizza, okay? Some of you might say cheese, some of you might say bread, food, pepperoni, whatever it might be. And what he would do is look at the comparisons of that and try to see if he could figure out how your brain was processing information based on maybe the categories or what you were saying. And that's the idea of consciousness, okay? Now, if I said something like the sneakers are okay, well, that doesn't really tell me much about that. Is it good or is it bad? But if I say overwhelming, that's more on the bad side or negative side. That's just like, I don't really like them, right? So as you can see, structuralism kind of died out because it's not really a reliable method, and you really need some people that are very vocal and verbal. And if you don't get somebody who has that vocabulary, you're not going to get a rich database in order to make it something you can measure really well. Okay, so a couple things I want you to do before you get to the next little section of lecture is I want you to stop. Again, you're going to go and do the Billy case study for the 4 goals, okay? And then I want you to, you can watch the little history video that I'm going to pop there too, but I really want you to do this Sapolsky thing. This is something you're going to have for in the submission. So Sapolsky's there, and he has a very fascinating way of looking at psychology. I want you to go up to where he talks about ancestors, okay? And there's like a little camel on the page, okay? That's about all I want you to do. You can watch the end of it if you want. He gets a little political. He's very liberal, but he gets a little political. But the rest of it is really fascinating of how he breaks down the reasons why something happens and explains behavior with one single action, how he kind of traces it back. Because we watched it in class and we talk about it. And it's really fascinating to see like how complex really psychology can be. So enjoy doing that. Okay?